Today, we're diving into a really provocative argument about the challenges of immigration, and what makes it so interesting is that it's written by an immigrant. The whole point is to start a tough conversation, and it all kicks off with one heck of a story.
So instead of jumping right into, a bunch of statistics or policy debates, the author frames their entire argument with the single, really vivid anecdote that takes place in a hospital.
Okay, so picture this. A hospital is absolutely chaotic, dealing with victims from an attack. A doctor is doing their rounds when a visitor for one of the patients starts complaining that the room is way too cold and basically demands they do something about it.
Now, the doctor explains, hey, the air conditioning is centrally controlled. I can't just change it for one room. But the visitor's response is just wow. They deliver this ultimatum. The doctor, who has a ton of other patients to see, pretty much just has to ignore it and move on. But then things take a turn. The premier of the state, a super powerful political figure, shows up to visit that very same patient. And what do you know? A few minutes later, a couple of AC technicians arrive and do exactly what the doctor said was impossible. They reset the air conditioning for just that one room.
But here's the kicker, right? There's a consequence. In the room right next door, a 74-year-old patient is suddenly shivering cold. The nurses are scrambling, piling blankets on him, even a space blanket, all because of the change made for that one important visitor. One action had an immediate, very negative effect on someone else.
So you have to ask, why start with this story? Well, the author's using it to set the stage for a much, much bigger argument. It's all about a specific kind of behavior they're trying to put a finger on. And that brings us right to the heart of the author's whole thesis. They're arguing that what happened in that hospital isn't just a one-off incident. Nope, they see it as a perfect example of a broader issue, something they call a culture of entitlement.
The author's main point is that it's become completely taboo to criticize these kinds of behaviors. They argue that if you even try to bring it up, you get shut down immediately, which means we can't have a real, honest discussion about how to build a functioning, diverse society. The author then lists 5 specific conditions where they believe these behaviors are more likely to pop up. This includes when groups are seen as victims, when they're very monocultural or bonded by a single religion, when they have no safe home to go back to, and, this is a big one, when they arrive in such large numbers that there's no real pressure to assimilate. When these factors are in play, the challenges of integration get a whole lot harder.
So, to back all this up, the author doesn't just leave it at theory. They actually present this detailed checklist of what they call maladaptive behaviors, which they believe get in the way of successful integration. And here's a pretty wild detail. The author says this list was actually generated by an AI. They say they did this on purpose to try and take their own personal bias out of it and instead pull from information that's just objectively available somewhere on the internet. So here's the list. It's got things like cultural freezing, where the old ways are idealized, and hyper-insularity, where a community just closes itself off. It also points to a victimhood-centered identity and even a rejection of host country loyalty. The author basically suggests that immigrants should take a hard look at their own communities and see if any of these patterns are showing up. This quote really ties all 11 of those points together. The author is saying the fundamental problem is when people see preserving their original identity as this all-or-nothing game, where any kind of change or adaptation is viewed as a total loss of who they are. Okay, so after all that analysis, the argument takes a really personal turn. The author shifts from these big ideas to their own story, and they frame the whole act of migration as a very conscious trade-off. And this is the big reveal. The author states it plainly. I'm an immigrant too. They talk about giving up their language, their religion, and their heritage when they moved. They're not saying that makes them better than anyone, just that they understood from the get-go that moving to a new country required a real sacrifice. And to really hammer home this idea of a trade-off, look at this comparison. The author describes their old home, South Africa, in these incredibly harsh terms, but then calls their new home, Australia, a nanny state that they don't even always like. The point is, neither place is perfect, but they consciously chose the set of problems they'd rather live with.
So all of this has been building to the author's final and maybe most controversial point. It's all about who should be responsible for making integration actually work.
And here it is, the author's conclusion, stated in no uncertain terms. They argue that immigrants shouldn't expect the host country to bend over backwards for them. Instead, the responsibility, the onus, is on the immigrant to make that first move, to adapt and to integrate. And so, the author's argument leaves us with this final, really thought-provoking question. It kind of forces you to think about what's given up, what's gained, and maybe what's owed when people leave one country to build a life in another. What really is the true price of migration?